Seated.
Recording in progress.
Anyone who knows me knows I love words. The word of the day is hubris. I thought of the word as I was writing this sermon, and I was actually a little bit unsure if there was a nuance to the definition, so I got my handy Merriam-Webster out, and I found the definition. Hubris is an exaggerated pride or self-confidence. The second note in the definition said, the word hubris comes from the Greek and was used in Greek tragedies and the stories of the gods of Olympus as a human trait that leads to downfall. In today's gospel reading, Jesus has again prophesied that he's on his way to Jerusalem where he will be arrested, tried, crucified, and died, and in 3 days he would rise. Mark notes that they did not understand him, but they were afraid to ask. Well, that's not the only thing they were afraid of. We read on. Jesus asked them what they'd been arguing about on the road, and they remained silent. Mark doesn't say it, but I can picture red faces and averted eyes. They had been arguing about who would be the greatest. Hubris. The gospel story ends with a scene that's very popular in Christian art and music. Jesus loves the little children, all the little children of the world. Jesus gathers a child, and it's a sweet scene, isn't it? Until we ask ourselves the question, why did he choose a child, and what did that mean? In today's society, we invest so much in our children, so our children have status. We spend a lot of time and effort and money in their education, nurturing, making sure that they're safe, making sure that they have play opportunities. Children are very, very important in our society. Was not always so. If you go back 2,000 years, the status of a child was one step below the status of slaves. Children were the most powerless members of society, and Jesus gathers the powerless and says, unless you receive one such as these, you cannot enter. That's the meaning of this gospel story. Unless you receive the powerless. We understand this story pretty well. After all, none of us is immune from the temptation to make more of ourselves than we ought. And I will stand in the front of that line. The dangers are many, but first social. Jesus tells in one parable, he kind of gives a warning to people. And in the parable he says, if you are invited to a banquet, don't go sit at the head table, because the host may come to you and to your public shame say to you, you do not have the status to sit here, and lead you to a lower place. So go and sit in the lower place so that the host will see you and say, come with me to a higher place. It's a humorous little story, but it is a true point. It is a true point. That is a real temptation. But there's more to this whole thing about hubris than just where we sit at the party we're going to next week. The more serious danger is how we can be led to assume too much, to take too much for granted, and worse, position ourselves as above and outside of others and what Thomas Jefferson referred to as nature and its laws. In other words, we're tempted to see ourselves as apart from rather than a part of the created order. It was interesting to me that our invitatory psalm today, and if you turn to page 6, if you want to read along with me, what are human beings that you should be mindful of them, mortals that you should seek them out? You have made them but little lower than the angels. You adorn them with glory and honor. You give them mastery over the works of your hands. You put all things under their feet. And that echoes what we read in Genesis. When God, speaking to first man and first woman, blesses them And God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and over every living thing that moves upon the earth." And we humans have read this and we go, yes, we have heard it all too often as sanction from God, as a command to dominate the created order, not to have dominion over the order we belong to. And we humans have understood wrongly that God has given permission to take what we want, possess, and use as much as we want, consume and destroy as we see fit, without regard to the obligation of justice, to share equally, and to care for the future. Is that an overstatement? Let's consider the story of our bird of the week. Now, I had decided early on that I wasn't going to join the parade and have a bird of the week. My subconscious had a different idea. I went to bed on Monday night, and I was in the throes of writing a sermon, and it's a very tumultuous and kind of upsetting week, the week before I do this. And it takes me all week, unlike some people who can sit down on Thursday morning and bang out a sermon, not me. So I was working away, and I had written a draft and thrown it away, and I was perplexed. 3 o'clock in the morning, my subconscious, if I have something to worry about, my subconscious wakes me at 3 sharp. It's uncanny. My internal clock is so finely tuned. I opened my eyes, and the clock said 3.00, and I knew I had something to think about. What I had to think about was a memory. And it's one of my favorite memories, actually. About 12, 14 years ago, Margot and I drove down to Monterey. And we like to go down and park in the Cannery Row area and walk down that walkway down towards Pacific Grove. It's our favorite walk. And we see all kinds of stuff. We see otters and we see seals sunning themselves on the rocks. It's wonderful. And we'd gone in the morning and we had lunch in the Cannery Row area and decided we weren't ready to turn around and go back, so we drove down to Point Lobos. Anybody been to Point Lobos? If you have not, put it on your list. It is an amazing place. Well, we drove down. Point Lobos is just south of Carmel. And as we were driving down, before we got to the turn into Point Lobos, there's some agricultural land there. And there are fences, wood fences, and on the fence posts, there were some vultures. So there must have been a carcass in the area. One of the vultures was really big. And on the vulture's shoulder was a medallion of some kind of tag, and on it was printed a number. And I wondered to myself, is that a condor? Well, a few years after that, Margot and I had gone down on vacation to my hometown, San Diego. And we had gone to the Wild Animal Park in Escondido. It goes by a different name, but it's an annex to the San Diego Zoo. And at the Wild Animal Park, they have a massive outdoor aviary. And it's huge. It's really high so the birds can fly. And what that is, it's one of the 2 breeding centers for the California condor. And all the birds had the plaque on their arm, all of them. And that bird I saw at Point Lobos was in fact a condor. What a rare thing. I really feel privileged to have seen one in the wild. And if you have, you should feel privileged too. In 1987, the population had crashed, so the last remaining birds were actually captured and were distributed to the San Diego Zoo and to the Los Angeles County Zoo to establish breeding centers because the birds could no longer sustain their population in the wild. They were declared extinct in the wild in 1987. The breeding program was successful. They began to release birds in 1991. The San Diego Zoo and Los Angeles Zoo do releases of birds at Pinnacles, at Grand Canyon, and at Zion National Parks. And there's good news. The good news is that breeding is happening in the wild. The bad news is that the future of the largest vulture in the world rests at the brink. In the 2023 bird census, the conclusion was there exist in the wild and in captivity worldwide no more than 560 condors. How did this happen? Some of you I know the answer to that. There are two causes. They're different, but both causes are human. One of them, sad to say, is human predation. And I don't understand that. I'll talk about that in a second. And the other is the widespread use of agricultural chemicals, particularly DDT. Human predation. I'm not the only person that absolutely is perplexed and flummoxed that some people not only have an impulse, but act on the impulse to kill animals larger than themselves, not for food, because after all, no one's ever heard of rhino rump roast. It's just not done. But because it's an act and sign of domination over things bigger than ourselves, and we take trophies, and we mount them on the walls to prove that we're above the natural world. And that's the truth. It's not just the condors. We were in Alaska, and in Ketchikan, there's a raptor recovery center. And you pay a little money, you get to see some of the birds there. They have a large number of eagles. There's two things that bald eagles, there's two things that are causing the injuries and the deaths to bald eagles in Alaska. Number one is they land on the power lines. And number two, people shoot them. Hubris. And that's not the only story. In 1860, it's estimated that the population of American bison exceeded 60 million head. There are stories, journal stories that tell us that, at least one story says that from a campground, or from a camping site, it took 3 days for a herd to pass the camping site as they migrated. A massive number, a huge number. And then they built the Continental Railroad. And the railroad went through Indian country and went through the plains, which was buffalo country, American bison country. And somehow or another, between 1875 and 1885, the population of American bison went from 60 million plus to 260 documented animals in 3 remnant herds. There were 3 individuals who never knew each other, who independently took the initiative to save those remnant herds. From that, we now have a population of approximately 500,000 buffalo American bison in the United States. About half of them are being raised for food. About half of them are in protected herds. Having trouble with my words here today. Now, why did they kill all the buffalo? What was going on? Well, there's actually 2 reasons. That they're complicated and stark, I admit it, but there's 2 reasons. The first is bison hide. In the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, when machines were run by steam power, the motive power was distributed to the machines by belts. Buffalo hide has this particular attribute that it's many times stronger than cowhide and much stronger than horsehide. The American Industrial Revolution was driven on the strength of American bison belts for decades. $3 a hide. And that $3 in 1874, 1875 was a lot of money. But in addition to that, it was quoted in 1879, I believe, is in a newspaper in St. Louis. An American general was quoted to say, "Behind every dead buffalo lies a dead Sioux warrior." Unlike the willful killing of animals, the other catastrophic factor in the near extinction of the condor and the endangerment of the bald eagle and other related raptors was the widespread use of DDT. At the beginning, we had no sense of the side effects of DDT. Now, it was first formulated in Germany in 1873 and patented in 1874, and there were no known uses for it for dozens of years. Until the early 1900s, it was discovered that it had amazing insecticidal power. World War II came along, and it was recognized that there was a real problem for the armies of the world. That problem was illnesses, and principally vector-borne illnesses, and there were 2 that were major problems for the United States Army. Those were malaria and typhus. And typhus, the vector for typhus is lice. So in 1942, the United States Army began widespread delousing of American soldiers, POWs, prisoners of war, and civilians in war areas. And this was performed in every theater of operation, and it was done throughout the entire length of the war. And no research that I could find was ever done on the side effects of DDT before the decision was used to use that on people. After World War II, DDT entered the marketplace as an effective insecticide for the agricultural industry. And although there was insufficient evidence, research, evidence began to mount that DDT was a potential carcinogen and had an effect on the endocrine system. But the chemical was powerfully effective for its intended use. And the agricultural and chemical industries fought ferociously to protect the use of DDT in the face of mounting evidence. In 1957, there was a fight in the courts of New York State over the use of DDT in the apple industry. And that was the catalyst for a woman named Rachel Carson to write her book, Silent Spring, which was the catalyst that launched the modern ecology movement. And that brings us back to this notion of hubris, doesn't it? These stories are instances of lack of insight into consequences of human activity based on assumptions that and this is important, based on the assumption that the resources of nature are boundless and that the health of the natural world is impervious to anything we can do to it. Sheer ignorance, and absolutely wrong. I had shared these two examples. To that could be added the near extinction of the gray wolf and the brown bear due to large predator eradication efforts in the 19th and 20th centuries. The near extinction of large whales due to whaling, the overfishing of tuna, the collapse of the Outer Banks for the cod industry, and the list is endless, goes on and on and on and on and on. Now we are increasingly aware in our times of the effect of global warming, or we should be. It's hard not to be. But in fact, isn't it true that there are forces active in our politics and in our in our industries that find it politically advantageous and financially beneficial to take the position that it's not proven that global warming is human-caused? To which I would say that's kind of nuts. Yeah, it's kind of nuts. But it is also reflective of that part of ourselves, that pull to do the thing that's expedient for ourselves. Now, we did the expedient thing with DDT in World War II, and it was a mistake. And we paid for it with the near loss of 2 keystone species. Now, those weren't the only animals that were affected by DDT, were they? But it came to our attention. We began to respond to that. The population of condors is climbing slowly. The population of bald eagles is climbing much less slowly, to the point that we had a nesting pair in Milpitas 2 years ago. First time I saw a bald eagle was at Burney Falls probably 15 years ago. I've never seen another one except on our trip to Alaska. But it's getting better. It's getting better. But it's getting better because of the rays of our consciousness and the decisions of individuals like you and me to do something that we cannot be passive. We cannot know and not act. We cannot feel and not respond. And that's why I really appreciate this liturgical season of God's creation. And I think it's a really valuable thing, because its purpose is to heighten our awareness, to sharpen that awareness, and to allow us to recommit ourselves to mindful living. So I've enjoyed our bird stories. Mine's dark. Sorry about that. But I believe that we need to be constantly reminded of what we do and what we don't do, and that those things, our actions and inactions, have consequences. That the mistakes of the past have been devastating, but it's criminal to repeat them. And also, it's not too late to repent and change. If we continue the work of weaving a healthy theology of creation into our religious lives and consciences, then we are helping to spread a gospel-centered ethos of reverence for the created order. And I think that should cheer us. I pray that the effect of this work, by all who participate in it everywhere, all the individuals who commit themselves one after another, and all of us together, that it will lead us to a point when it's much less rare to spot a California condor sitting on a post out in the wilderness, or to see with our own eyes, as I have, a blue whale breaching off the coast of Santa Cruz, or a pod of orcas in Puget Sound, or gray wolves wandering Yellowstone National Park, and be moved to a deep gratitude for the beauty of the earth and our participation in it as a part of the created order. Amen.